come, we'll have to thank Rosanna as well for her recommendation, because neither Sarah nor I expected to be speaking at something like this to all of you. So thank you for listening to us, I guess, in the beginning. As Regina had mentioned, we're from Amina, the Muslim Women's Resource Centre, and we're a national organisation, but based very much in a Scottish context. We work with Muslim and minority ethnic women, and we're a grant-funded organisation. So we basically have projects that are reliant on funding and that usually are fairly short term. But our two biggest projects that myself, Maruk, and Sarah are from, our Helpline and Violence Against Women projects, are both funded for 3 years, and the Scottish Government actually gave us an extension for another year as well. So these projects are probably the most developed out of all of the ones at Amina, and are definitely the ones that we get most of our development work from, because we are directly in engagement with our community members and we build on a lot of the issues that they present to us. So our existence is quite rare and also often sometimes a bit precarious. And the reasons why it's quite rare is that we do have the ear of Scottish Government. We do have funding even within a pandemic like the COVID crisis, and we are lucky enough to keep our jobs in this respect. But because of our association with Scottish Government and the various national frameworks that we sit on and are part of designing sometimes, we have a lot of credibility in that regard. And we are able to then develop women who come through the organisation as staff members, volunteers, or as our service users, to be able to fulfil our mission, which is to empower and support Muslim women to oh, sorry, my internet connection is unstable. Just let me know if you can't hear me. But yes, our mission is to empower and support Muslim women and ethnic minority women to create an inclusive Scotland where they can fully contribute and participate, benefit from society. So to be able to fulfill that vision, we have had to think very carefully about our demographic. And it relates very much to the title of our presentation today about transnational lives, transnational identities, and valued lives. So Sarah and I had done a lot of research and a lot of thinking into what really makes Amina Amina. And one of those things was that we deal with women who have an array of understandings of their social, cultural, and economic rights, their political rights, different understandings of power dynamics abuses, different understandings of what makes them happy and able to fully contribute and participate in society. And that may come from their families, their traditions, their communities, and may come from their cultural and country backgrounds, and it may come from the Scottish background in of itself. So we really had a lot of these different aspects of people's identities to work with. And we were searching for a term, and we came across the idea of transnational identities. And that kind of encompasses the idea of a person moving from place to place, but also the idea of ideas moving from place to place, where people may have an intersectional idea of who they are. And the concept of intersectionality is from Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, but this almost goes past that, where she was talking about gender, race, class, and that coming together to form the experiences of a woman. We're looking at how women themselves perceive what their rights are in any context, given all of the different intersections that they have in their identities. So it's quite a complex thing that we do. But what we're going to speak about in this presentation is actually how looking at our support work from a human rights perspective enables us to move past the structures, the society, the political, the economic pressures of living within a Scottish context, and also helps us to enable women to look past all of the understandings that they previously have known or have made up through their experiences going through life, and focus on being able to support them from the very basics that every human being should have. So it kind of moves us past how other people have agendized the people's rights and enables us to focus on what their rights should be and how women want to achieve and understand their rights. So on the slide here, we have a description of the projects that we have running at Amina right now. The helpline is the one that I'm on, Sarah's on violence against women. We both do development work in campaigning, and this is an integral part of everybody's job role at Amina WRC. But we also have employability, ending isolation. We have our digital inclusion project at the moment through COVID-19, and we have our campaigns work as well. So the campaign I'm currently running is called Reclaim the Name, and is focusing on Muslim women's identity in various different ways and encouraging them to be able to use their own voices to articulate their needs and their rights in this country. And Sarah's, she will come on to as well. One of the most important things that I'd like to draw on from our research about transnational identities that we'll need going forward for the understanding in this presentation is that there is a concept of nations. And transnationalism is a term which kind of goes past that to a degree, even though it has nation within it. So as an example, while Western nations might eventually recognize immigrants who adopt the values and norms of their nations as true members, and that can be disputed, but to greater or lesser degrees, that is essentially what Britain and North America and several other nations say is their narrative. Then this might also be impossible or very difficult to achieve in other nations. For example, at the time that this was written, they were doing research in Eastern European immigrants coming to North America and Asian immigrants coming to North America, and the idea that within these contexts, it would not be a similar narrative, nor would immigrants be considered as part of the nation. So we're really working with the idea that Scotland has a narrative which says that we are, or all people living within its borders, after we've looked past immigration and things like that, should be able to contribute and participate fully. And so within a Scottish context, this is one of the things that Amina MWRC is aspiring to do. Sarah, I'll pass on to you for the next.
So I should disclose that I have a habit of putting a lot of waffle and kind of buzzwords and things on PowerPoints and then forgetting to explain the relevance of them. So I would really appreciate questions and comments to keep me on track. But I think that's in my sort of outside of Amina, I am studying as a public sociologist, and I've been really interested in exploring some of the sort of political philosophy and the sociological ideas that link in with the work that we do at Amina. And one of the things that comes to mind for me is that we are quite a small organization and we work with quite a small group. So looking at maybe around 3% of the population of Scotland would fall under our remit. And I think that enables us to do a wide variety of things to meet the needs of that group. So we're working with various forms of injustice, potentially injustices that are highly relevant to this context, such as we worked with an intern who looked at whether Scottish organisations supported women who'd experienced sexual violence during war, and produced a dissertation around that, which can improve practice. But also working much more locally and within Scotland, within the UK, and also trying to link in with other organisations doing similar work elsewhere to share good practice. And thinking about frames such as socio-political, frames such as, very personal issues around being isolated and kind of linking in with friendship and building skills. So we can work with a lot of different issues using the common thread of community learning development. Let me see if I can change the slide. So the next few slides are quite sort of theory heavy, as I say, and I'll try and rush through them because you could easily read what's on there. But I think that one of the things that we're trying to do is link theory and practice, and that enables us, I think, to link sort of policy world and the legal framework with the lived experiences of women as well. So if you're not familiar with community learning and development, the UN definition is a process where community members come together to take collective action and generate solutions to common problems, which is a little bit like the consciousness raising movement that came about in about 1970 through feminism, that women were sharing issues and working out what they had in common and how to perhaps take action around that. So it could be described as critically engaging with the life role of participants and their circumstances when we're organizing our activities. So we're not doing something at them that we've decided they need to learn. It's very much co-generation of knowledge and also of strategy, and ensuring that it's based on lived experience. So I chose this slide here because this was a presentation I developed for training on violence against women, but in engagement with this particular group, I then changed the slides as we were working together so that it continued to be informed by the lived experiences of different women. This, for example, on risk factors around forced marriage, there was a lot of experience in that room that informed the training going forward. And that also allows women to keep their anonymity while sharing really useful experience. So a theorist that I really like, and I've stuck to one, I promise, is Nancy Fraser, who is a political philosopher. I don't know how many of you would have heard of Nancy Fraser, but I find her useful because she had a quite structural look at different forms of injustice. I know there's other framings of injustice that are useful, but what I like about Nancy Fraser is she links quite well with the idea of the public sphere. So how civic society can inform law and policy. So she kind of typified 3 different types of injustice. So injustice around economic, resources types of things. So unequal pay for women would be one example. Injustice of misrecognition. So that's more cultural injustice. And I think there's been more of a trend in her point, certainly when she was writing her papers around this, was it's more of a trend towards recognizing these forms of injustice. And also misrepresentation. So being stateless, not being able to vote, which is a big discussion just now as we're running up to elections here in Scotland, but also in the USA quite soon. And then she very handily looked at how we could address these injustices. She wasn't just complaining. And she had like a kind of liberal model and a radical model. And as a social democrat, she was generally speaking more in favor of the radical approach herself. But I think when I'm working with women and we're talking about different things that are going on and what we can do, I'm much more about listening to the types of remedies that the group wants themselves, because that's their comfort zone, that's what they see as appropriate. I don't want to impose my own political views. And sometimes also working with a more liberal model can be much more well received by the state, which is sometimes a really good strategy. So yeah, I won't go into all of this, but I think it raises interesting questions around whether we always want to be on one side or the other. So why are we doing this? Why are we working on multiple injustices all at once? Why not just tackle one? And I think that partly this is because we work with many different groups of women, and there's not going to be one thing that everybody wants us to do all at once. And I think that it's more useful for us to listen to what's going on for women and feed that back. And I think there's quite a good, I'm going to just wave this book at you, I'm so sorry, a book that I would recommend by Nancy Fraser, and it's called Transnationalizing the Public Sphere. So she kind of takes the idea of obviously Habermas's public sphere, she didn't think of it, but how we can actually use that to talk about inclusion and exclusion, talk about who's in that public sphere, who's listened to, who is going to have their views adopted by mainstream narratives and why, and how to challenge that and how to capitalize on the fact that there are counter publics who are having different conversations, who can use those conversations as a kind of catalyst for activism. So sometimes that can be about the preciousness of self-organizing away from groups. So for example, this evening when we're going to have the listen in, there's not an opportunity to pitch in with lots of different opinions. It's about a group talking among themselves. And so I wanted to say as well that if anybody struggles to access any of the papers I mentioned, if you drop me an email, I can try and send them to you. I'm happy to do that because I know sometimes if you're not signed up to Shibboleth or your university library doesn't have subscriptions, I'm happy to send them across. So I liked a quote from the beginning of this book where it's talking about participation having to be inclusive and reflexive, but also effective. And I think that's one of the important things for me is moving beyond identifying issues towards building strategies as a group. And I think we can always learn from other groups on how they've done this. So I wanted to bring Maruk in at this point. We were talking a lot about what it is to be, you know, somebody with transnational lived experience and what that might look like. And we think that potentially there's perhaps more of this experience within Muslim communities than there is in other communities in Scotland. So Maruk, am I surprising you? Do you want to come in?
No, no, you're not surprising me, thank goodness. Yeah, so I think that especially because we've been working with our client group for a long time, I think, but Sarah's been at Amina WRC longer than I have. I've been here about 4 years working on the helpline team. We're hearing a lot about the different ways in which women's identities are kind of impacting them, and we wanted to really use this knowledge to develop or design or support mechanisms for generating the outcomes that we need for them. And so the first part of that was to really kind of look at what makes a transnational life and why exactly it is that Muslim women were focused on in the beginning when the organization was started about 21 years ago. And one of the things that was coming to us was that Islam in and of itself, or being Muslim, is almost inherently a transnational experience because of the different parts that play in our lives. It might very well be that there's a very high proportion of Muslims who do have different ethnic minority backgrounds within Scotland. But even aside from that, the idea that this was an ideology which spread from a different place in the world and migrated, and as it migrated, the ideas developed and formed, and the concept even of Sharia, for example, seems a lot of time people's understanding of that is that it's a very codified form of law that all Muslims follow to the letter. But in actuality, it's like a living, breathing, very malleable framework with an underlying code of conduct, but it changes according to context. And I suppose a very easy example for that would be from some of the talks that we've had today about the state that identifies as Muslim, ISIS, and how they've been acting within that particular region of the world. The rest of the billions of Muslims don't recognize it, and they don't recognize it as Sharia, but what their Sharia has been, or what their path has been, which is what the word means, has been maybe maladapted, manipulated and distorted, but they have something. It's something which unifies, and they use religion as a basis for it, correctly or not. But it's there. So their Sharia is something which is very specific to their context. No other Muslim recognize it, but they consider themselves Muslim for whatever reason. So people all around the world have different concepts of Sharia, and it comes from the scholarship, the community, the leadership within different contexts, and responding to the problems that Muslim community is facing at the time. So it is very flexible in that sense, and that in of itself speaks to the idea of being transnational. We do have to take into account the laws of the land that we're living in first and foremost, but if the laws of the land that you're living in say you can't be Muslim, then that we still exist. So how do we exist within a nation state and still abide to different laws? We have different codes of conduct that regulate our lives, and different things that affect our experiences. And this is what we're looking at when we say transnational. And there can be different influences. For example, for me, learning about Islam, I might look to American scholarship on particular subjects because they might represent my point of view in a globalized way more than my context. The scholars in my context represent my point of view. So there is an accessibility there that we now have with social media and the internet that also makes it globalized, but it has always had a transnational flavor. So that's something which has been very specific to our demographic, and has really helped us look at, okay, what do human rights really mean for different people in different contexts? Because in Scotland, it wasn't necessarily built on Muslim ideology, or it doesn't have necessarily a Muslim history. So that population might not be necessarily considered when lawmaking is put into places, right? But Muslims still live here. And how can they be reflected? How can the Scottish government agenda accommodate them? And does it ever clash? Is there a culture clash sometimes? Is there a clash of ideas sometimes? And how do we overcome that to make sure that everybody's rights are fulfilled? Everybody's rights are fulfilled. So there's a very specific place in society that Amina has to kind of occupy and it can be stressful sometimes.
So we made a couple of case studies to illustrate this, because I think it's sometimes hard to go from abstract to kind of the practical implications. And I've based these on kind of composites. They are in no way representative of one person, but they are representative of the issues that we work with again and again. And we do work with women of other faiths or of no faith. We work with all women from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic backgrounds, as well as Muslim women. But these case studies seem like the most representative. So just while I'm reading them, just kind of thinking about barriers that women might come up against. And also, I think for me, they illustrate that how we understand migration has changed a great deal. I think there used to be a narrative that people would go from one place to another and stay there and not really go back and forth very often, and not necessarily communicate very often with the people that they used to know. Whereas I think now folk are moving, or certainly we're more aware that folk are moving across very different countries and sharing information within diasporic groups, and with that, and finding out about what life is like in different countries in a very different way to what used to happen. But I think there's an issue around access to information there, and not everybody has access to that sharing. So beginning with Tamana. So Tamana is from a rural area of Bangladesh, and she's 35, she has 3 children, and she has Bangladeshi nationality. She came to Italy from Bangladesh on the equivalent of a spousal visa, and she's now moved with her husband to Scotland. She doesn't have any qualifications. She left education at the age of 12. She's never had paid work. She speaks good Italian, but does not have a strong command of English. So this is somebody that we might work with, and thinking, right, especially at the moment in the context of Brexit, how that might play out for somebody. And then also thinking about Aya, who was born in the USA and moved to Saudi Arabia, where her parents were from, when she was 6, studied in Canada, then Sweden, then went back to Saudi Arabia, married and established a family, had children, and is now working on her PhD in Scotland with her children, but not with her husband. So again, thinking about what might play out for Aya. We've made another slide. What might help though is if I copy and paste this into the chat potentially. So I'm just going to break out of this slide sharing. It's going to stop looking neat, and I'm just going to copy and paste just to make sure people can refer to this as we go on. And then I'm going to come back into slide share. So sorry about that. Please, if you have any questions, now would be a great point to ask. Oh no.
Okay. I have a quick question, actually. And forgive me if I ask this the wrong way, it's just because I'm trying to understand. What happens when when women come to you and they have a cultural belief that is actually against the law in the country that they're in, but it would be valid under Sharia?
Or under the laws of a different state, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, so like I'm thinking more like something like female genital surgery, or however people, I know there's different ways of saying that now, but that's the example.
Okay,
yeah.
So the one that I thought of was, because I was thinking about this the other day, was smacking. So like physical or corporal punishment of your child. Where it's maybe a little bit less contentious to talk with a community group about. Oh wow, is my screen flashing for everybody else?
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Oh, super. All right, I'm gonna stop and start again. Sorry about that, everybody.
Do you want me to take on the question while you're fixing that, Sarah?
Sure, and then I'll come back to smacking.
Okay. So I think to address your first point, so the example you gave of female genital mutilation, that is not necessarily incumbent in Sharia. So Sharia is not that specific. In order to retain its flexibility, it's not that specific. But it does very clearly show the link between religion and culture, and how they can be very interchangeable sometimes. So female genital mutilation is more of a cultural practice as opposed to a religiously sanctified practice, although people might be able to draw on religious inspiration for it, as people draw on religious inspiration for many things. So I wouldn't want to discount that, but it's not a majority interpretation of how anything in Islam has come about. So with things like that, when people do have, I guess, a culturally divergent perspective on what their life should be like, compared to what life might be living like, and life might be in Scotland, this is, I guess, where our rights approaches kind of come in, because a human is made up of so many different things, and presumably the culture that they were born into, to last that long, the culture must have some kind of benefits for a group or the majority, and then there will be significant disadvantages for minorities. So we're looking at the fact that this woman might have benefited from different parts of her culture, and then these particular parts are challenging for her, or specific parts of a culture which she wants to bring in, because now the culture here is challenging for her, might not fit. So we're working with her to find out, okay, what is kind of the necessity behind this? What does it give you? Is there any other way that you can achieve this in your life? Because here it's not legal. So kind of telling her rights in terms of law on both sides, but then also putting her experience in the middle to enable her to get to a position where she's readily able to accept the difference that she needs to have in her understanding coming from one place to another, if that has to be the case. So she may very well choose to just go back to where it is culturally acceptable for her to do that, because she wants to, and it's a massive part of her life, and we wouldn't necessarily be able to stop her in that case, because she has that right to autonomy. But if she was to stay here, we can readily provide her all information about it and more besides to help her to make that decision. But more than anything, Amina would be the space where she would be able to talk about that and why it's important to her and what it does for her, and then find other ways of maybe being able to fulfill the needs that she has, if that one can't be met.
Thank you.
So we will come on to FGM a little bit later if we have time, because we've worked quite a bit around policy in that regard over the past year or so. But one that comes up again and again with community organizing, I think, is discussing smacking. Is it okay to smack, or is it okay to leave my 6-year-old looking after my 2-year-old? So these are things which may be okay in one place, but are not okay in another. And I think having a non-judgmental position on where somebody might be coming on, like Maruk was talking about, is helpful, because people don't want to go to a community group in order to be judged or chastised, but also a really firm grasp of the local laws is really helpful, because it can avoid people running foul of the law. And I think that obviously the way the law works is about, in this case, harm, and we want to avoid anybody causing harm to anybody else. But also, if somebody doesn't have access to understanding the law, or what laws are and how they're different to laws in other places, I think that community development work can play a really important part, because it can be a forum for people to explore why we have particular laws, and in some cases develop strategies to be quite comfortable within that context. But I do find it's quite a responsibility, because if I say something, say if it wasn't evidence-based, it does, you can hear it go around the community and come back exactly verbatim how I've said it, 3 years later, from somebody who I can't connect to the other person I told it to. So I think there's a real responsibility incumbent in the community work that we do, where we're telling people things that are helpful and evidence-based for that reason, and allowing them to explore why we have those laws. And we will come on to equally safe a little bit later, hopefully, where there's a bit of opportunity to discuss that. So for this slide, so we've had our case study, which hopefully everybody can see in the chat. And then some of the areas that we thought might be relevant for thinking about how transnational experience might bear on that. Things like child rearing, so whether you can leave your child alone, financial security, migration status, and networks. So thinking about, with maternal health and child rearing, how you access healthcare if you're pregnant, for example, can really vary from country to country, and the information sharing about that is really important. how single parents are perceived. And with regard to financial security, some countries don't have the state benefits that we have here, things like child benefit that can be accessed depending on somebody's resident status. And also there's a big issue here in the UK about having no recourse to public funds, which is almost like on hiatus in terms of how we deal with that because of Brexit. But then just recently there's been rulings around it from a human rights perspective in terms of how children are affected by destitution. And as I understand it, there should be help given before they're in a situation of absolute destitution based on the precedent that was set with that ruling. And then thinking about migration status. So in the first example, it's not clear from how she presents to us whether Tamana has the right to be in Scotland and whether she understands that she should and that will affect how she can move through society because she's kind of been moved here by somebody else. And then things like networks, and where I think will hopefully come on to explain how Amina can play a part in this, but thinking about even idea of social capital and how people might know people or who they might know who could help them. Having this transnational lived experience can really have a big impact on the kind of network somebody has. So Marika, you're going to come in now.
Yeah. So thinking about like all of those things around maternal health, financial security, migration status, and networks, the reason we put those kinds of things first and then the rest of them also follow on is that before somebody has necessarily come into contact with Scottish society, they may have lots of different ideas about how these things impact them in general. So for example, for maternal health or child rearing, if they're from a family or a culture, and that could be within Scotland as well, where their family has always been around them and they have always needed to have people to kind of pass their child between, and the child was reared by a village, so it were, then to be divorced and to have to move away from that presents a lot of challenges for the women that we deal with, a lot of them. And they're like, do we stay for the children? And then it goes on to the financial security as well. Someone who hasn't necessarily been encouraged to work necessarily for a living, or someone who's had other people to look after them, or someone who's young, or someone who's been studying, etc., coming across these problems, not really knowing how to interact with the job market and what that would mean, or if they've been out of work because of they've been having children for a long period of time, they come back into it and they don't know how to navigate it. That's a massive thing that we deal with, along with the migration status in the network. So having social capital within one community but not having any in another one because of racism, the way that cultures can create the idea of social capital as well compared to other cultures can be very different. So moving between those ideas is really important for what we do, and really trying to understand where a person is coming from so that we can help them get to where they want to be is crucial. One of the things that maybe makes it most evident and hardest to deal with sometimes can be a level of education, because you get some people who will have very high degrees of education, like we had in the previous case study, but sometimes those qualifications from a different place may not necessarily count in the UK, or they may need to start again but be in a position where they can't necessarily do that because of financial security, or because of their families, because they don't know how the system works. And really we get to see a lot of how education isn't necessarily just schooling as well, but genuinely how people understand the systems and structures of how our society is built. Because if you are part of multiple cultures, then you have multiple cultures shaping your understanding of what it is, like we said with social capital, to move up in the world, what it is to get ahead, what success looks like, who you talk to, how you talk to different people, how you deal with the police, how you deal with the government, do you vote, do you not vote? All of those things can be learnt behaviors from all of the different cultures and experiences that you've had. So this is something which we're constantly working on in our campaigns and things like that, to make sure that people understand, whether they choose to use them or not, what their rights are, what the possibilities are for their community's civic participation and engagement in Scotland. Because if they do have problems that might be rectified with something like that, if they are worried about representation, which we can come on to with the media narratives, then that is one way around it. But it's something that needs to be taught and learned, as opposed to something you can expect people just to pick up. And we get a lot of people coming to us, offering us the opportunity for consultations and to get women to feed into things. And we can do that. But we usually have to do a lot of prep work with women to make sure that they understand why we're even asking them that. So there's a lot that goes into the building of our projects. One of the main things that, well, actually two of the main things we're working on at the moment are kind of narratives around Muslim women, ethnic minority women in Scotland, and how much these narratives can shape people's perception of seeking help even. So these kind of narratives, for example, very recently I was doing a, what do I even want to call it? A community engagement event, I suppose, on the concept of abuses within faith communities, faith and spiritually based communities. So that doesn't have to be just Islam, that's everywhere. Yoga communities, and things like that too, where there's a concept of like a higher power, or trying to reach out to something else that can guide you or present a calling to you in life. And the idea that some people within these communities felt as though if they reported, then they would either be demonized by that community, or their community would be demonized by people on the outside. And this is one of the reasons that they don't do it. So media narrative doesn't just affect how people engage with society, it affects how people consider themselves worthy of support and help, and how readily they would accept or have confidence that another community would be willing to help and support them. So it's a big thing for us to kind of combat at the moment. And mental health as well, and the different cultural aspects of what people consider as a strong person, as a weaker person, as something you can get around, what are coping mechanisms, all of those things. I mean, it really shows us, I guess this slide and the slides before and the case studies really show us that working with transnational identities just gives us a much richer understanding of really what humans are like. And we're not saying that any of these problems are specific to the communities that we deal with, although we deal with a wide range of them. We're actually saying that this is probably for humans much more broadly, but because they are not in a majority position, that this is affecting people in a different way, because they maybe don't have access to opportunities to changing their levels of participation, contribution, and therefore their levels of cultural awareness and cultural competency, and increasing the cultural competency of the majority group either, which is where it comes on to government. Sarah, I'll pass back to you.
So what am I doing now? Like moving slides, or have we covered? Yep, happy. Okay, sorry. Okay, so I think one of the things linking in with the idea of accessing government structures is the way that a democratic will can become law and policy. And I think that supporting women to become part of that process is a really important part of our work, but also the support for women's well-being to be in that space where they can exert decision-making capacity and input into things. I think supporting women who might be in quite difficult situations in terms of just purely culture shock. So, you know, even somebody with very high degree of education and confidence coming into a different country, even if they've done it before, they might not expect to experience the levels of isolation or potentially discrimination, or just how, you know, the lack of familiar context can affect them at different points in their lives. But also we do work with people who have experienced trauma through war or through state-based torture, as well as other forms of interpersonal violence. And so I think one of the important things to bring in, and something that I think we're doing quite well in Scotland, is thinking about perhaps using a trauma-informed approach to designing support and designing community learning and development contexts. So a trauma-informed approach is really about empowering someone and thinking about how to avoid putting them in situations where they might be re-traumatized. So it might impact on the films we choose to show, or the discussions we choose to have, or how we choose to have them, where we're not just kind of, I think sometimes in the past there's been organizations who have been trying to do something urgently around issues like female genital mutilation, where they've kind of ended up showing films that were really quite shocking and unnecessary or things like that, because those were the tools that were available at the time. Whereas now I think we know that that's maybe something that can other or stigmatize someone. And that I think first and foremost, working in a person-centered way to help somebody with having their identity affirmed and respected is a really important part of supporting someone with that journey. And I think also having that non-judgmental approach and working in an anti-oppressive way is something that's really important, and that impacts obviously in how we recruit and how we train volunteers and that kind of thing, that we're having this constant conversation around what might be the best way to approach something or frame something to be the most inclusive and to acknowledge oppression in a sensitive way. So in terms of advocacy, again, just thinking about co-generating knowledge with women and thinking about what advocacy looks like for those women that we work with, who might not necessarily be representative of all Muslim and Black and minority ethnic women in Scotland, because some women who don't have a need of us might be sort of, for example, the majority of the demographic of Muslim women in Scotland are from Pakistani backgrounds. So Scottish Pakistani women perhaps might not have need of us, even though they are 93% of the Muslim women in Scotland. Whereas we are working with, I would say, certainly in Dundee where I work, the majority of women have some kind of transnational lived experience. So how we build that into our work and our advocacy is important. And I think that lack of understanding of laws being different in different places is a really important example. So this image, so the one on the left, this is part of the awareness raising sessions that we do with women around issues relating to gender-based violence, sort of gender-based discrimination. So we have a kind of birdcage model where we write on different things that women might have encountered in their lives or heard about in the news or things like that. And that's kind of including women, and women are able to contribute whatever is important for them. And then that allows us to build on potentially campaigning and the kind of projects that we're looking to fund. And then the ones on the right are about kind of encouraging women to participate in something called Reclaim the Night. So obviously in different countries there are different activities like this, but in the UK, I think in the US there's Take Back the Night, if that sounds familiar. I don't know if anyone would be familiar with that. In Pakistan, they've had marches recently, and there's a lot of things like this that go on, but this was one that was happening in Perth in Scotland. And it was really enjoyable for women to come along and take up space in public at night, because that's something that some women do find difficult, and contribute to making placards that made statements that were important to them. And we go kind of from that to, you know, informing things like state policy, working with Scottish Government to make sure that that includes the needs of the women that we work with before laws are made. So we're going to talk about what each project does, and we're not necessarily going to talk about every single one. So this slide is about something that we did kind of on a very short-term basis to encourage women to think about electoral participation. So learning about voting and about the different policies of the different parties that were running for election. And it was really popular, and a lot of women that came along were particularly concerned about any changes that might be happening around Brexit, because I think what people don't always realise is that when these things are in the news, that there are women with transnational lived experience who are wondering about how that impacts on their right to remain here. And it's not something that's frequently addressed. So this one project obviously is a project I work on. So it's called the Ending Violence Against Women and Girls Project, and it does things like campaigning. We make films. Please check out our YouTube channel. We have lots of films, including one based on our men's work called Imams for Change, that I think is a really good model for working with groups of men and using faith as a strength to kind of enable change in communities. The two pictures on the right, we took some accounts that women had shared with us and anonymized them and made them into short plays. So they were kind of building on that cultural kind of change that we were talking about earlier, thinking about how to share stories to change how women are perceived. So it's not just about kind of maybe seeing someone as a victim or seeing someone as other, but hearing the full picture of somebody's story. And we link in with the government policy that we have in Scotland called Equally Safe, which is a really interesting one to look into, I think, because it does frame gender-based violence as a cause and a consequence of gendered inequality. So our project allows us to address gendered inequality in lots and lots of different ways, with, you know, sort of very kind of old-fashioned nuts and bolts sort of consciousness raising type work, as well as fairly nuanced policy work as well. And then Maruk, I would like to bring you in to talk about spiritual abuse and how that's a transnational issue that we're interested in at the moment.
Yes, it's a transnational issue that we'll be really building on. So if anyone is interested in what it is, the work that we do, we recently brought over Dr. Ingrid Matson from the US and Canada she studied in the US and Canada and worked in both, and has set up her own organization called Hurma, if you want to look it up, where she takes a very holistic approach, which is what Hurma means, which is talking about the innate spiritual capacity of a human being. And spiritual abuse is essentially the manipulation, exploitation, or general abuse in all the ways that we naturally understand it: emotional, mental, physical, psychological, financial, that can happen to our spiritual capacity. So, for example, it might look different across different genders. For women, it might be it might come across as abuses in terms of marriage, in terms of the rules around marriage, in terms of power dynamics, and being encouraged into positions where they have less rights, but are considering it because the person who's asked them is seen as higher up in the community in terms of like their spiritual knowledge or their understanding or the religious institution or whatever it is. For men, it might be the extortion of finances from them, to be able to give back to the community, whether or not they might have it. So just the kind of the manipulation really of what people are trying to achieve when they act on whatever feeling they have inside them that's calling them towards something more spiritual, and using that and the benefit of the doubt that we've recognized actually that people largely have within their communities, their families, and their leadership within spiritually based communities. There is a large feeling that they will give the benefit of the doubt to people because they consider that religious communities or faith or spiritually based communities will come together principally for the good of everyone, and they want what's best and they have good intentions. So the idea of speaking out or to term something abuse can be really quite challenging, and there are loads of challenges associated with reporting that as well. So we're looking into that along with women's aid organizations in Scotland. We're working hopefully in future with people in England and also in the US to try and create some standards to regulate any kind of manipulation, exploitation, or abuses within these communities. We're also doing a lot of interfaith work in that respect. So this is one way in which we're trying to do a lot of consultation before we go ahead with things, because like Sarah was saying, it is a transnational issue in the sense that people's experiences can vary massively. No one group is homogenous. So we're really looking at, on a basic rights level, what can we do to protect that? And then the choices people are making and the way that they bring their different understandings to it might be on a different level. We don't know yet. It's very under-researched in the UK. So it's a very interesting and developing project at the moment. Oh, this is mine. Okay, so I'm going to go through this quite quickly so that we have time for more questions. But what you can see on the slide in front of you is essentially 3 different things that we've been doing over the past few years. So there's me standing next to one of our local councillors, one of our previous MSPs, a member of Scottish Parliament, which is different to the UK government. So Scottish Parliament doesn't have the same powers as UK government does. We only have certain devolved powers, which means that we can only affect legislation in certain areas. But we are encouraging more people to get into positions of representation, and Scotland is very low on that. So that's one of the things we're doing in partnership with people in England. We've also got our schools project, where we're going into schools and to supplement the RE curriculum, talking about Islam as a lifestyle as opposed to just a group of rules, and also answering the children's questions, which we think is quite important in terms of narrative correction and things like that, to enable people to ask questions in a very open and frank way and be confident enough to answer those, but also within a learning environment, so they feel more comfortable going on and framing their questions in different ways comparatively as well to the different faiths that they've been learning about. So there's lots that they can really ask about Islam and ask about how we live Islam, and yeah, we can personalize that for them a little bit. So there's benefit from both sides. And the last is something from one of our previous campaigns, which was another narrative changing campaign around women considering what their transnational identities actually were and what it meant for them to be living in Scotland. So it was something for the women, but then also it was exhibited for the Scottish population in general as well, in our libraries and city council building and exhibition places and things like that.
So just coming back to how we would co-generate knowledge with women that would inform policy. From my project, from Violence Against Women and Girls, a lot of the work that we do ties in with our Equally Safe strategy. So this is something that's kind of Scotland-wide and is much bigger than one organisation. It's going through all strands of government, really, like national, in terms of how we create laws, and local, in terms of how we shape local violence against women partnerships, how policing is working on the ground, how social workers might be trained, all this kind of stuff. But also how somebody might experience higher education. There's Equally Safe in higher education, so it's a huge, huge thing. But I think sometimes, because it's very heavily informed by, so the kind of the women's rights approaches, say from the 1970s onwards, at times it can benefit from intersectional kind of additions to the lens of kind of gendered inequality, and understanding that perhaps somebody might not necessarily experience violence from their husband, but might from their mother-in-law, for example, and how that doesn't negate the fact that it's gendered. So I think these kind of nuanced intersectional understandings are really important for how any resulting laws are sort of shaped and formed and enforced. And so one of the things we've done relatively recently is inform the legal consultation that we had around the new law on female genital mutilation, which is the legal phrasing. I understand that there are different ways to phrase it, such as female genital cutting, but I tend to refer to the phraseology in the legislation because it is a little bit less ambiguous doing it that way. So that involved working with women and having discussions on how these sorts of things affect them, informing the law as it was shaped by giving evidence to Scottish Parliament alongside other organisations such as the Kenyan Women in Scotland Association. And then we will be hopefully informing the statutory guidance, which obviously with the current lockdown has slowed. But it's been quite an important piece of work to ensure that women were able to contribute to share what might be barriers to, for example, reporting. Because if a law isn't going to result in anybody reporting violations of it, then there's not really going to be much use. But yeah, I think that it can be a little bit frustrating sometimes, specifically around migration, that we're in Scotland and we're informing law and policy in Scotland, but there are reserved issues such as migration where we can't really do that much advocacy without maybe having the resources to link in with other organisations in other parts of the UK, which potentially could be something that we do in the future. So Mar, can you come in?
Yeah, so I think this is the last slide we're going to show and then leave it for questions because we only have 5 minutes left and we're very cognizant of that. So I guess the only additions I have to this is around our hate crime work and feeding into policies in Scottish Government. One of the things most recently was they were trying to create one package for the hate crime legislation, which was previously separated into different categories and different laws. So we're trying to bring it together so there will be the same kind of impact regardless of which of the 5 characteristics, that mean race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, and transgender identity, that you would be reporting under if you enacted the hate crime law. So we were talking about that and the fact that those characteristics were in silo. But actually, like if we want to consider the experiences of Muslim women, like is there anything that we can do to be able to mark out one or more of those characteristics in one, so at least it's reported, even if one was one of the characteristics, for example, race was the primary motivating factor for the crime being committed. This would also we would hope help with the precedents for the equalities and discrimination legislation, which is completely separate and used in spheres like education and employment, because at the moment, from studies and from speaking with some of the people who've engaged with Amina who are lawyers, there isn't much precedence for some of these cases to go through, whereas with hate crime legislation, we know that there have been a lot more reports and a lot more women talk to us about discrimination in employment than they do significant hate crimes like being attacked or harassed on the street. So we mentioned that to Scottish Government, and that's just possibly one of the ways that we're working on this. But also, just to frame everything that we're talking about in terms of community engagement, we do actually have a helpline. Like, people call in and tell us stuff aside from our community engagement events, and they touch on all of the issues that we've spoken about.
So there are a few more slides I'm not going to show you, but our contact details are on the end, and there's just some requests of ways you can get involved as well on the slides. So I'm going to stop sharing now so you don't